All right, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And if you've been with us for a while, you know that we are in a series of episodes on the theology of creation. This is not a topic that that we think about a lot here in creationism, which is a shame. We ought to think about it a lot. But usually we just talk about the details of the science and then we, sit back and say, you can trust the Bible, and that's our theology. But there's a lot more to it than just that. So we decided to have this 3-part series. We started off with Judd Davis from Bryan College, and then we had one of our regular guests, Hans Madueme, on the last episode. We talked a lot about what doctrines are and how they work together. And we talked a little bit about the end times with Judd. We should probably return to that. Don't you think, Paul?
I think so. It's been a really great series. And if people are kind of tuning in for this one and they haven't heard the first 2, they really ought to go back and listen to those, because they were really interesting conversations we had with both those guys.
Yeah. We will definitely put links to those in the show notes. So today we have another returning guest with us. We have Rahel Wells, who is coming to us as a professor from Andrews University. She has a doctorate in Old Testament from Wheaton College. So welcome, Rahel.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here.
Great
to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
You might remember Rahel from last year, about this time. We talked to her in our series on natural evil about whether God cares about animals, which is an very interesting question, because there's lots of people out there now who are trying to tell us that, creation is exactly the same as God made it, except for sinful humans. And that's it. That's the only curse on creation. And nothing has happened to the animals. And they're sort of implicit in that, God is kind of indifferent to the animals. And I don't think so. So definitely check out that episode if you haven't seen it. We will definitely put a link to that in the show notes. So on to today's subject. So as I said, we talked about doctrines and how they work together. We've talked about end times questions and all that good stuff. But it seems to me, and this has become a bigger and bigger theme in my life as I've gotten older, we ought to be thinking about what it means for us, like, practically speaking. Jesus told us the great commandments, right? To love God and to love your neighbor. He gave us a great commission to go and make disciples. We are to love our enemies. We are to love our neighbor as ourselves. There's a lot of really practical wisdom in the teachings of Jesus. And it seems to me, creation ought to have a connection to that. So Rahel is going to help us explore that topic today. So I thought we'd start. This is right up your alley, I hope. And that is the image of God. So image of God is a massive thing in Christian philosophy. I see it over and over and over again. It crops up in creation. We talk about the image of God being a thing that separates us from the animals. But biblically speaking, at least in the Old Testament, it's not a very common phrase, right? The image of God occurs in Genesis 1 when we're created. We see it again, I think, in the opening of chapter 5, when the author there rehearses Adam's creation. And then we see it again in chapter 9 when Noah's talking about, God is talking to Noah about murder. This is why you shouldn't murder people.
Right.
So can you give us a little background on that, on the image of God? What's the Old Testament scholars saying these days about the image of God?
It's actually still a very challenging topic, not just for non-scholars, but for scholars as well. I would say that probably it seems like every scholar who's wrestled with this in a bigger way has a different, slightly different view. So it's challenging, right? Partly because of what you shared, that it's not very common. It's not like it comes a lot of times. And secondly, like there's no definition of it, right? Certain other things in the Bible, you might have definitions or God gives examples of what this means. And we just don't have that much. It's just used of like, well, of course you have the image of God, so therefore you're valued, right? Um, so people through the centuries, the millennia have wrestled with this. There's been all sorts of things that have been said. It has to do with intelligence, or it has to do with emotional awareness, or it has to do with spiritual connection, or it has to do with some sort of abilities that animals don't have. Um, there's a whole gamut, a range of
Yeah.
things. Um, the challenging part, I think, especially as someone who also has a degree in biology and thinking about this as far as animals, pretty much almost the majority of ways that people have looked at this don't work with all animals versus humans, right? So there's, in other words, some things that we think, oh, humans are better than animals at, but there's almost always an animal, at least one animal that's better than humans, right? In that thing. So that's made it very challenging because you might say, okay, in general, humans have this that animals don't, but then there's always something that would counter that. So, um, I think probably the most consistent one people have used is like connection with God, spiritual focus. But even there, as we talked last time, you look through the Bible and the animals also have a connection with God on some level, right? It may not be the same level that humans do. So I have felt unsatisfied by most of the ways that people have handled this issue theologically. Except for, I think, as you hinted at already, this idea that we get from the ancient Near Eastern examination, which is that the image is not something internal, but more of a role, right? So you have, for instance, you see this in Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar after he has the dream and Daniel explains it to him. And actually, even there in the dream, it is using a lot of things that he would have understood as a Babylonian king, like the person being a sign of destiny. And these four metals in order were used by other ancient Babylonian philosophers to talk about epochs in history. So then when he makes this image of gold in chapter 3, it uses the same word there. Of course, it's Aramaic, but versus Hebrew, but it's the same word. And this image is not him, right? But it's kind of to represent him or to represent, some scholars think, Marduk, which was their god, for the people to worship. So when the people couldn't see Nebuchadnezzar, they could see the image and they could
Yeah.
think of him as the representative of Marduk to them. And so to me, this has made the most sense of what this might mean in Genesis 1 is that humans are to be this image of God, right? So we are
Mhm.
representatives of God in this world. And we are to care for what God has made, to do what he would do. The ultimate, what would Jesus do, right? If
Yeah.
we're the image, we're to do what he would do. So to me, that's helped me a lot. Again, am I 100% that is exactly what God intended that to mean? No, right? But it seems the most consistent with how humans are portrayed as caretakers, as stewards, as kind of rulers in God's stead, which also makes us valuable, right? It doesn't diminish our value, but it gives us that responsibility, um, that role, as it were, in the world at large.
Yeah. Yeah. You talk about how scholars have different opinions even now. I read a lot about this subject because I'm interested in humans and human origins. And I had been reading a lot of Old Testament scholars, and it seemed to me that what you just described, this is it. This is the consensus. This is what people think. And then I started reading some theologians who have a completely different perspective, and they describe in their books, this is the consensus. This is what everybody believes.
Yep.
I thought, wait a minute, what? It was very disorienting. So, yeah, you're right. It's extremely confusing. So the image there you describe, you're talking about, and this is one of the weirdest things I think I encountered in my reading. The image, the word for image in Genesis is sometimes used for idols. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. Yeah.
like the Nebuchadnezzar's image
Yeah.
would be an idol.
Yeah.
Yes, so
Yeah.
something again that represents the God, right?
Yeah.
So it's a representative of the divine being behind it, supposedly, right? I mean, so that's what the people at the time understood it as. So in fact, in Daniel 3, I don't believe that's an image of Nebuchadnezzar. I think it is of Marduk, and this is what many scholars do think, right? That he was not necessarily making an image of himself because Babylonian kings were not worshipped as gods, but they were kind of the god's emissary, right? So they are representing the god to the people. So it was probably of Marduk. I mean, we're not 100% sure, but as we're not
Yeah.
told, it's just this image,
Right.
right? But it's
Yeah.
but they're worshiping and bowing down to it. They're not bowing down to the king, right? They're bowing down to the image. So this would probably represent the god. Yeah, so it
Yeah.
does. I mean, it's obviously, I mean, a Christian would view that as that's being perverted, right? By God's original intent was
Right.
for us as humans to represent him. And so it's perverted by the other pagan nations to represent their gods as well. So you have that kind of um, tension really in the text.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and this goes back to also actually in Genesis 1, it's not just image, right? There's also the word likeness. And
Likeness. Yeah.
because that is tended to be viewed in kind of a parallelism, some people have said that these are the same thing, but I'm not certain that that's the case. Right? This is, for instance, Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. But verse 26 says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And that word likeness is usually used for more appearance. So again, we don't know, you know, what this means exactly. But if we think about the fact that when people see parts of God, right? I mean, how do you, when God shows
Yeah.
himself, right? Whatever that means exactly. Again, I'm a biblical scholar, not a theologian, so how we think about that theologically is even more challenging. But like Moses sees his back. It talks about,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
God has, and then God appears in Daniel to the with the three in the fire. He appears
Mm-hmm.
like son of the gods, a son of
Right.
God, right? So is there, I mean, I've wondered, I don't know, but is there some way in which humans also appear more like the best way we have to describe God's appearance, right? I mean, what even that means, I don't know. Obviously, he's so far beyond us. We
Right.
don't understand that. But there's some level to which we are representing God both in our role and in our likeness. And perhaps that gets at also what's happening in Daniel, right? Where this is looks like a human-ish, although it's not exactly because the dimensions of the image in Daniel 3 are very strange. 6 cubits by 60, so it'd be like super tall and skinny, right? Which is often how they represented their gods. So it's like, but not like, right? And I think this
Yeah.
would get at, male and female, for instance, are in God's image. We're different, but we're God's image. So it's obviously not exactly a likeness either. So we're left somewhat hanging, but I do think that this is perhaps part of it, that I feel that because this is specifically about representing God, there is an element of mystery. And there's probably something which we won't fully understand, right? Because we're human, we're finite. He is God, he's infinite. So he's trying to use words, inspiring Moses to use words that are the best possible thing, but it's still not going to fully satisfy our understanding yet, perhaps. I've
Right.
often thought that as well, right? There's some,
Right.
we can do the best we can to wrestle with what this means, but there's always going to be something that we're not going to get.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've really answered my question, because I was going to ask about whether you thought there was a difference between image and likeness. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that in the book of Genesis, when Adam has a son, we're told that he was in Adam's image and likeness, which is
Correct.
interesting. So there's something of a physical resemblance going on there, perhaps, but it maybe has a wider meaning. The other thing I was just going to ask about, am I right in saying that in the New Testament, the word for image is icon, which of course,
I think that's right.
Is that right? So that sort of draws out this whole image of a representation of the gods, as you've been describing it in the Old Testament. An icon. You think of an icon as an image of a god or a saint or whatever. So it sort of draws out that meaning, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I want to be clear, I'm not trying to say that God is a physical being and that we look like him, right, in that sense.
Sure.
So
Right.
just that God is using these terms because that's the best he can to describe something that's far beyond our understanding. So because I think the reason why people have implied that they're the same versus different is this whole idea, well, God is only spirit and we can't quantify him, and he doesn't want us to try to make an image of him, right? So so we have to hold those two things in tension. So I don't know exactly how to deal with that, and if it does turn out that they're the same, I'm fine with that too, right? I don't think it has to be. I think there's a tension there in the text even itself as to what exactly that means, right? So even your son being in your image and likeness, they're not you, right?
Right.
Are
Yes,
they,
of course.
do they look like you? Maybe, somewhat. But I mean, you also have kids that don't look anything like their parents, right? Or don't act anything like their parents. So is it more of a expectation? Is it a plan that God has? Or is it anyway, I just think there's all sorts of nuances there that I know theologians have thought a lot more about this than biblical scholars, as you noted, Todd, because I think theologians are kind of thinking that whole Bible picture, trying to understand what that means theologically beyond simply the few texts that we have. So I don't pretend to say that, I don't want to say that they're wrong, right? I'm just coming at it as a biblical scholar trying to say, how is this word used? How is it manifested in these different texts where it is? And again, I think the Daniel text has helped me the most, probably, as I'm thinking back to Genesis.
Yeah. I think, the more I've thought about it, I'm just going to throw this out before we move on here. The more I've thought about it, the more I feel like resemblance and likeness is implied even in the idea of the image as an idol, right? Because a piece of metal or a rock or a piece of wood, those are not images until you carve them into some sort of visual clue, right? And I think it's easiest when you think about the Egyptian gods. I think that would be the easiest for the audience to recognize. If you see a person with the head of a jackal, that's Anubis. And it doesn't matter that Anubis doesn't exist, but there's that visual cue. Oh yeah, that's Anubis. It's not just a piece of rock or whatever. So
correct.
It feels like everybody's right.
And that could very well be.
Yeah.
One of my close friends wrote her whole dissertation on this topic, and it's just super long. And she actually tackled each one of the theories and felt the similar that, that each theory has a point, right? It's not that they're wrong. They have an aspect, but they're also missing other aspects. And so, she kind of tried to pull it all together, but still felt the mystery at the end, because it's just very challenging for us to wrap our minds around.
Yeah. But even if we grab onto this one part of it. So let's say
Mm-hmm.
there's this one part that we think, yeah, that is insightful. This idea that we are here to represent God in some way.
Right. And that's transformed my view of my role as a person, right?
Yes.
Because it's so easy to think like, what am I one little person doing here, right? But if I actually have that role, it's not just some intrinsic thing in me, but it's like something that I've a responsibility that I have to
Yeah.
represent God, to really think about how would God operate in this situation. And it really helps me to kind of stay grounded as to my purpose and meaning in life.
Yeah. As you said, it's the ultimate what would Jesus do?
Yes.
Um, so what does that then mean for us? Not just in terms of sort of daily activities, yelling at bad drivers or
Yeah.
expressing our outrage on social media, but you know, there's got to be bigger issues. And I was thinking as I was, planning this episode out, I was thinking there's got to be a lot of relevance to medical ethics as well. It's not just how we treat creation, but how we treat other images.
Mm.
Yes.
Could you speak a little to that maybe?
Yes, certainly. So I have the privilege of teaching a bioethics class here actually at Andrews. And um, so we talk about this kind of thing a lot actually. What does that mean? How do we apply then our both our own responsibility as image bearers and our role to bless and care for other people with God's image? Um, I mean, I think this goes all the way from conception to death, right? And everywhere in between that there's no one life is more valuable than another. Doesn't
Hmm.
matter what that life is like, whether they
Hmm.
are poor or, you know, what their skin color is or how old they are or their abilities, their lack thereof, right? And I think we tend to value the rich, the articulate, the ones who can do all of the things.
Hmm.
Um, and that's not the view of scripture. Every single person is equally valuable in God's eyes. And as you noted already in Genesis 9, that is why we don't murder, right? And I think this then applies to all sorts of other ways in which we treat people. Jesus talks about how, calling someone a fool, being angry is the equivalent to murder, right? How we treat people in our hearts, how our views of them are. And this is hard, especially I feel like in this time of polarization, extra
Yeah.
hard, right? People are very polarized and even more so maybe than we were before. And how do we how do we care for the person with whom we vehemently disagree, right? This has been a hard thing for me. I think in my own family, I have several people with whom I very strongly disagree politically, and um, I've tried to keep this in mind. I love them. I care about them. They are God's person. They are God's image as well, even if I disagree with them. So therefore, I need to treat them with respect. I need to respond kindly to them, even if they aren't responding kindly to me, right? So it really does impact every way in which we live. Um, Medically, I mean, I think of how many people don't value the elderly, right? Like you mentioned that the elder care. Um, how are we making steps to change that, right? In our own communities, in our lives? Do we just dismiss people are who have Alzheimer's, who dementia, my grandma had dementia for many years and before she passed away, and it really gave me a lot of thought, right? I
Yeah.
value her the same, even though sadly she's not, with us mentally, but in God's eyes, she's equally valuable, right? And I think this is a really hard concept, but something that we really need to think about. Same with the unborn or the the those who have defects in their bodies or minds, right? How can we not try to get rid of them, but value
Yeah.
them?
Yeah. 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 I think You talk about Alzheimer's. We'll get a little personal here. I think I can do this. My dad just passed away 2 years ago.
Sorry.
Yeah, 2 years ago. Yeah, from Alzheimer's, and it was a very mournful, sad experience. But it was also, I don't know how to describe it, theologically rich and meaningful to me. It seems very weird and disrespectful to describe it that way, but I had the privilege that his personality was entirely intact. Even at the very end, when he didn't recognize me and Mom, he still was my dad. Recognizably my dad.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was. So I knew he was in there, even if his brain was failing him. But at the same time, I thought a lot about, what does it mean? What is God doing here? What does it mean for us to be human when the very things that seem to make us human, right? When you think about the image of God, you're thinking about your mental ability and your ability to, in anthropology, we talk about making tools and mastering your environment and all sorts of great things that mark us off as human. And here is a human being who has passed those days, and he is not doing those things anymore, but still the image of God, and he's still there. And it was a remarkable journey. I don't want to do it again, but it was a remarkable journey.
Well, and that makes me think of, just how so many times in the Old Testament and throughout the Bible, God is giving indication that he is looking at how we care for the vulnerable, how we care for those who have no ability to contribute to society. Of course, he doesn't mention Alzheimer's there, but he mentions the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, right? These are people that would not have been contributing, right?
Yep.
They're people that most people would be like, let's get rid of them, right? But God instead is like, no, they matter to me. And so much so that I'm going to judge you based on how you treat them, right? And so this is called
That's right.
the vulnerable triad, right? The implication is anyone else who is vulnerable would be fitting under that. And I think we could classify Alzheimer's patients or
Sure.
um, unborn, right? Others who are vulnerable to oppression, and they matter. And God holds us accountable as a society, as individuals, for how we care for those people. Um, and I think your testimony is really beautiful, right? This idea of he's still my dad. I still love him and
Yeah.
care about him. Even if he doesn't recognize me, he's still my dad. And I think this is how God views us, I think, when we are in those states, right? This is still my person. This is still my
Yeah.
child, even if
Yeah.
their mind is gone or they're incapacitated in some fashion.
Yeah. There's something immensely divine and Christ-like about caring for those who can't reciprocate, right?
Correct.
I mean, that is exactly, like you say, that is exactly how God looks at us with our sin and our, messed up creation and messed up
Um,
ourselves, and we're puny and small and we don't understand anything. And yet he cares for us every
yeah.
breath, every bite of food, every drop of water. It's all his divine care. And so, yeah, in a sense, we become most like God when we're caring for those things that are the least desirable and the least reciprocating.
Yeah, it also reminded me of this parable that God tells Ezekiel in Ezekiel 16. It's the whole story is a hard story to read because Israel, of course, turns away from God. But the very beginning, it describes how God says, you were a baby thrown out to die, wallowing in your blood,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And I rescued you, right? No, everyone else passed you by, but I brought you in. I washed you, I cleansed you, I cared for you as you grew up. And so just this idea of like, yeah, we're off. Even those who are cast out, those who no one wants, no one cares about. God's like, I care about you, right? I
yeah.
am going to rescue you. I'm going to save you. I'm going to clean you off, and I'm going to raise you up, right? And that's the image that we are to bear to the
Yeah.
world and to others.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
And
same way.
I'll throw this in here too, just as a little bonus. A couple of years ago, I was researching bubonic plague of all things.
Mm.
And in the history of the church, there was an early plague outbreak. And like you say, you get somebody who's undesirable in those days, you just kick them out, right? And with plague, there's no curing it and you die. So people who got sick were thrown out, and the Christians were the ones who came in to care for them.
Mm.
And in some cases, giving their own lives to care for the people who had become sick. And this was a remarkable testimony there in the Roman Empire, where the culture was utterly the opposite. If there was a plague outbreak, just throw them out and let them die. And if they don't, they can come back. But otherwise, they're dead. They're dead already. And the Christians are like, nope, we're going to take care of these people.
Yeah.
And it's just it just struck me as a really startling episode in church history, a place where being Christian and having the Holy Spirit working in your heart really transformed a cultural moment in ways that are deeply, deeply Christian, deeply Christian.
Yeah. That's
All right.
powerful.
Yeah, it was quite powerful. Okay, that's end of life stuff. Let's talk a little bit about. So I mentioned this too. Let's talk a little bit about those moments of anonymity. There is something profoundly dehumanizing about social media, right? Or being alone in your car and yelling at traffic or whatever. And should we, is that the time to think about the image of God? Maybe more than any other time? I don't know. Practically speaking, it seems like kind of an important moment for us. So Paul, do you yell at people in traffic? Do you get upset online and post nasty things on social media?
Well, we've all kind of been there, haven't we? In
Haven't we?
traffic.
Yes.
Yeah, and the temptation is always there on social media because, as you say, it's anonymous.
Yeah.
You can hide behind, you talk to people on social media, or the temptation is there to talk to people in a way that you'd never talk to them face to face.
Right. You get punched.
Yeah. Yes, quite.
You say that to somebody, you get punched in the face for that. Anyway.
Yeah, quite. But it's dehumanizing is the right word, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think this kind of the culture we live in is so social media driven.
Yeah.
People live their lives, don't they, on social media and vent, about whatever it is, politics or whatever. And it's so easy to do. And it has no consequences most of the time. So it just brings out the worst in us, I think.
I have certainly found myself carried away by the anonymity of it all. You can just take those angry thoughts and put them in writing and hit send before you even realize what you're doing, because it's just words, right? It's just words.
Right. Yep.
So it's not a person. So to me, this is one of the most, I don't know, upsetting, dangerous things about social media is what it's done to us. And frankly, the internet in general, right? Just before it was social media, I was sending nasty emails. So it wasn't just social media. And it's really just, we're losing something. And Rahel, you mentioned the polarization in our country. There's a lot of that. And what's startling to me is how fast it happened, right? It didn't feel like this when I was a kid. It didn't feel like this in the 90s, when the internet was just taking off. But now all of a sudden, boy, if you're if you got the wrong political answer, boy, you are evil, and I have to oppose you. And it feels like this anonymity, this dehumanization, this removal of us from human interaction has turned us into monsters almost.
Well, and I would say it's a both and thing, or you have two kind of extremes, because I tend to fall in the other extreme, which is that I don't speak up.
Ah,
It is hard for me to speak up because I don't
mm-hmm.
want to be I'm a peacemaker at heart. I don't want to, be involved in things that are complicated and challenging and where people might yell at me. So, I have the tendency to be silent where I need to speak, right? And
Yeah.
I think people tend to fall in one camp or the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Either they're like,
Mm-hmm.
"I'm gonna fight this battle," right? Even though this is another image bearer that I'm fighting, saying mean things about. Or it's like, I don't really wanna step into that even though I should, and I should speak up for this vulnerable person, but I'm too intimidated. I don't wanna get involved, right? That's their thing. So I think we have challenges on both sides. It's not just a matter of I'm speaking bad things, but it's also a matter of I'm not speaking where I should be speaking. And so, yeah, this polarization has affected us all in some way, whether we're
Yeah.
the ones who are the angry ones or speaking out where we shouldn't, or whether the ones where we're not speaking out where we should.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And it's with everybody so angry, it is very easy to just say, I don't want to get into this
Mhm.
because this is not going to end well. I want
Yeah.
this person to be my friend, or this person is a family member, and I don't want to have, big knockdown arguments at Thanksgiving,
Yes,
whatever.
and I have tried in the last few years to be better at this because I see the need and I've gotten
Mm,
into, I've called out certain family members for saying racist jokes, which I never would have done in the past. And it's been really hard and I've lost some relationships over it and it's difficult, right? It doesn't mean that it's easy. So these kinds of things like holding in your temper when someone else is angry at you is not easy. Speaking up to against oppression, or inappropriate treatment of others is not easy. It's a sacrificial type thing. You have to be willing to um, give of yourself in ways that are going to hurt. And that is also not something that's comfortable
no.
or easy
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah. But that's what God did for us here in the
Correct.
sin-ruined world. He gave until it hurt. He gave,
Yes.
he gave everything. So that is another point of divine likeness here as we exercise the image of God.
Right.
Well,
Very much so.
let's sort of shift gears here. Maybe we've gotten too much into politics. We're going to get comments. I just know it. Anyway.
Sorry.
No. I'm not sorry. Um, yeah, let's talk a little bit about, there's a related concept here in Genesis 1 when God creates human beings.
Mhm.
He blesses them. He tells them to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. We've done that pretty well. And then he tells them to have dominion and to subdue creation. And as he
Mm.
creates Adam, he puts him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. Keeping, that's a really interesting word.
Mhm.
So, I think back over recent history. I remember, and this is very famous. Some of you might not know this, but there was an essay in 1967 by a fellow named Lynn White, who it was called "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," and he argued that the reason we have pollution and all these problems with the environment is because Christians have devalued it. They look at the dominion mandate here in Genesis 1 and they think that creation is just here for us to exploit and use like a divine right of kingship, right? king is the place of God, so he can do whatever he wants. And so that means that we as people can do whatever we want with creation. And I suspect he has not got a full view of theology here. Can you help us understand a little bit about dominion and subduing and working and keeping? I think there's more to it than that.
Certainly. And this is another area that is complicated and people have differing views, right? But I do think it's important to recognize that God says this twice. So he says this in verse 26 of Genesis 1. So he says, verse 26 reads, "Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the livestock, all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So there's a bunch of things there: the fish, the birds, the behemah, which is the larger land animals, over all the earth, and the creeping thing, right? So then he creates humans, male and female. And then in verse 28, he comes back, and this is where we have the word subdue. And actually, I believe even many others see this as well, when you look closely at the text, that this is not just talking to humans. So similar to the end of day 5, when God tells the birds and the fish, he says, he makes them, and then he was like, blesses them. This is verse 22, and he says, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters, let the birds multiply on the earth." So he's talking to everything he created in day 5. So here at the end of day 6, he's talking to everything. And I think we can see this clearly. Well, he's talking to the humans and the land animals. So verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish and over the birds and over every living thing." Notice what he does not mention there. He doesn't mention the behemah, the land animals, because that's who he's talking to. And he doesn't mention all the earth because that's only humans, right? So humans have dominion over the whole earth. Land animals only over the fish and the birds, right? So they have a limited dominion. And we actually see this. If you took humans away, land animals would still have significant impact on the earth, right? Beavers are architects, right? Other, you have predators, you have all these things, right, that are happening that impact and affect the earth. And so I actually think that God is giving a limited role to the land animals, but then humans have the greater role. They're also in his image and all of that, right? Which you don't have in verse 28. So, in light of that, I also think that the indication that dominion, like we already talked about with the image, this is not domination, right? This word dominion has to do with, like you already mentioned, kingship. And so if we are to be God's representatives, then we're to be kings like he would be a king. And in fact, this is the thing that he says. For instance, when he describes what a king should be like in Deuteronomy 17, he says they should not get a bunch of wealth for themselves. They should not, get an army. They're not supposed to take a bunch of wives. They're supposed to read from the Torah every day, write it out for themselves so their heart is not lifted up above their brothers, right? He's very clear about the king should be just like everyone else, but he's a leader, a servant leader who is leading the people in a right way towards God. And so this dominion was never intended to be domination or tyrant rulership, but instead this servant leadership, right? And I think you see this in the verse you already mentioned, Genesis 2:15, to serve and to keep. And these two words are used together only one other place. They're very common words, but they're used together in the care for the temple. So, and when you look at Eden in Genesis 1 and 2, many others have noted this, that it is portrayed as a temple. It has elements of an ancient Near Eastern temple. And so God is, I think, very intentional about portraying it in this way so that we will care for it. We are to care for Eden like we would care for the temple. This is God's house. It's his, he owns it. We are the servants caring for it in his stead when he's not there. So these two concepts, I think, have been very helpful for me in understanding what's going on here. God is not giving ownership to us. The earth still belongs to him, and he makes this clear through the rest of the Bible. The land is his, earth is his, and he holds people accountable who don't care for it. In fact, when he sends Israel into exile and when he sends the Canaanites away, part of the reason he tells both of them is, you haven't cared for the land. You haven't preserved it. You haven't shown me that you've given it rest and care, protection. You've decimated it instead. You've destroyed it. So I think when we look through the whole Bible, we see this consistent picture of God's care for the earth, and then us as his representatives, as his earthly kings, rulers, we are to do the same kind of care. We have that same responsibility. We have it before sin, we have it after sin, and I dare say even the pictures of the new earth imply that that is our same role there. We probably have other roles too, but we are still caring for the earth. Isaiah describes the new heavens and the new earth, and humans are still there caring for it, right? So on some level, that has been our role, is this care for what God has made to represent him to the world.
That is really different from what Lynn White wrote.
Yes.
Yeah.
But Lynn White is reflecting, I think, the way many Christians view these verses, right? Which is, they belong to us. God gave us, have dominion, right? We think of dominion because we import meanings onto these words from our experience, right? If someone has dominion over you, we usually don't think of that as a good thing because humans are sinful and they carry sinful tendencies. And so dominion is usually power over. And this is why I think Samuel is disturbed when Israel's like, we want a king, just like the nations all around us. And he's like, are you sure? Yeah. They're not good for you. They are going to take your women. They're going to, take tons of money from you. They're going to send your boys to war. Like, do you really want a king like the other nations? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Right? The people would say so. And I think the point is not that kingship is bad, but the point is their desire for a king like the other nations, rather than waiting for God to give them the king after his own heart. And so, but even then, when they do, even David doesn't, the man after God's own heart, he does a lot of not so great things, right? I think when we put sinful humans in power, they tend to not act like God. And power, unfortunately, often corrupts people or encourages them towards corruption, right? And I think this is a huge challenge. And so Lynn White is reflecting this perception that a lot of people have of someone in power is going to dominate. And so that view does lead to a lot of problems, like this whole view of, well, the earth's going to burn up anyway, so we should just destroy it. Doesn't matter, right? And those kinds of things, those kinds of mentalities happen because of that view, or at least they're impacted by that view of Genesis 1. I just think Lynn White is focusing on one small aspect rather than recognizing the whole Bible picture of it. But it's still a fair assessment of many Christians, unfortunately, and how we have treated our mandate to care.
Yeah. It's an odd thing, right? Because there's the image of God, which sets us apart from creation and makes us more valuable, right? So, and you talk about the levels of dominion, and I would certainly say people are more valuable than an animal, for sure.
Of course.
But that doesn't mean the animal is not valuable.
Correct.
Or the forest is not valuable, or the rivers and the world that God has given us is not valuable. It just means that we have a higher rank.
But again, what is that higher rank, right? It's like if our higher rank is there, it is there to be responsible stewards, right?
Yes.
Not to make ourselves more wealthy. And I think this is where we often get into trouble. Well, this would be good for humans because it'll give us more money and greed and all of this, like
Yeah. Yep.
that's not the point of what God is saying there. He doesn't give us more value in order to have us destroy the rest of his creation. He
Right.
gives us more value so that we can care. One of my mentors at Wheaton, Dr. Daniel Block, um, wrote, he describes this triangle relationship. So you've got God, you've got land, and you've got creatures, right? And all three of those have covenants between them. So God makes a covenant with the land. God makes a covenant with his creatures. God makes a covenant between the land and the creatures. And in the very center are humans as
Hmm.
the ones holding it all together, right?
Wow.
So we are the caretakers of the covenant. We are to make sure that the land is in good shape so that God can have this covenant with it. We're to make sure that the creatures are in good shape so God can have the covenant with it. We're to make sure that there's a co-equal relationship between the creatures and the land, that all creatures are dependent upon the land. They're dependent upon the earth. And so we have this role as this kind of mediator and helper. So we tend to view our role as it's our land. We can do whatever we want. We're to make ourselves better because we're the most important. And that's unfortunately a very inaccurate view of, I think, what the role God has given us as the mediators of the covenants.
Excuse me.
But it's rare, right, to have this view. And I think also to how that plays out in real life, right? It's easy to say that in our minds, but we still, like the next person, want the newest iPhone and want I mean, how do you change your life to seek to, I mean, we also have, 8+ billion people, right? Or is it more
Yeah.
than that now? I don't
Yeah.
know. I think we're close to 10
It's
coming up
more.
somewhat soon. Yeah.
We're getting there. Yeah.
So, like, that means much more people. We've got to value our resources more and not just decimate them. And do we really need the newest thing? Can we instead thrift shop and as much as possible? I mean, I just think this plays out in so many aspects of our lives, not just theoretically, but if I really do value other people as image bearers, and I also value the creation that God has given me to care for, that's going to impact how I live my life. And it's going to mean I'm going to try to live more simply and less, materialistically, and try to stay away from the rat race of let me buy all the latest things. I just think, unfortunately, though, that's not the mentality of most people. And I struggle with it myself. I'm not trying to say I have it all figured out, right? But just it's easy to look and like, man, I want that, right? But
Sure.
do I need that?
Sure.
And how can I live well in all aspects of what it means to be God's representative?
Yeah. I think, thinking about those small little practical details of our lives, I think that what we can do perhaps more than anything else is to look out for each other. So I'll give you an example. True confession time. Here it comes. Last fall, my wife and I got really, really sick. We had the norovirus. And if you know what norovirus is, we were pretty incapacitated. If you don't know what norovirus is, I invite you to go Google it. I'm not going to describe it here. It was terrible. But we were so incapacitated, I could do nothing but lay there in misery. And I, during that period, got absolutely, my social media use went through the roof because there was nothing else I could do. And it stuck. And I found myself hours a day just wasted on social media. And my wife felt the conviction about her social media use. And so she put a timer on her phone that shuts her social media off after a certain amount of time, which I thought, that's great. So I was watching her do that, and I thought, I gotta do something about this because I can't keep wasting my life away with social media. She said, you can put a timer on your phone. And I said, nope, because I'm way smarter than that, and I will shut it off. I said, you need to put a timer on my phone and put a password on it. And
That's
she
awesome.
did. So now I am suddenly limited, and as soon as time is up, boom, I'm done. So I find myself, it's weird because I'm having withdrawal, of course. This is literally last week she did this. So I'm still in withdrawal. I'm still, I don't know about this. But at the same time, we're having conversations. It's very strange. But I think that's, you're driving yourself away from the dehumanization of that, right? And the just feeding your endorphins in your brain with, silly cat videos and fail army and useless stuff. That just makes me laugh. But, I'm trying to get my humanity back a little bit, trying to get back to something better than where I had been. So, but, I don't feel like I could do it if I had to do it on my own. If, the idea of having the willpower to just stop doing bad habits and start doing good habits, it's really tough. And I think that's part of why God put us in communities, to help each other to think on the good things and to not think on the bad things, and to not get caught in, the worst cycles of living. And like you say, being greedy and wanting the latest gizmo and gadget and whatever, and just, put it down, turn it off and put it down, and have a conversation, talk to each other, talk to another human being. Yeah, it's, I think it's going to be the only cure we can have for our current predicament, is to just stop listening to all the rage bait on social media. We're going to have to turn it off, and we're going to need each other to be able to do that. And I hope that happens before something really terrible happens, because that's the only other way out of the current situation, is some atrocity. So I'm hoping, be encouraged, people. Turn your social media off. Stop looking at stuff, and go back to being a human being again.
Well, and I think
Paul?
that,
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you? Yeah. It's designed to be addictive.
It is.
And it's designed to keep you doom scrolling, and you just need to come up for air, don't you?
Yeah.
And it's a good thing to switch it off. Get out in the fresh air. Go and talk to people. Go and enjoy God's creation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's even worse. I mean, it gets worse and worse because of all the AI slop that there is out there. Because most of it's absolute nonsense. And it's getting harder and harder to discern truth from reality. And yeah, it's where is it going to go? I don't know. But you're right. We need to break this cycle somehow.
Yeah. So
well, and even Genesis 1 and 2 indicate that, both men and women are needed for God's image. And then in Genesis 2, it's not good that we're alone, right? We've got to work together, because and I think social media, as well as the polarization, as well as just our society in general, tends to push us to individualism rather than community, right? We're known for that, especially in America, right?
Yes,
This whole
America.
very individualism, right? But God is calling us to a different path, to this community, this thinking about other people and how are we going to work together. And it's just a very different picture of reality. And yet one that's really important that we keep reminding ourselves of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting to me. You mentioned individualism. Yeah, the way we've spread out here in America is so different from just the geography in Europe, where you have everybody living in tiny little villages or in big cities or whatever, and trains connect everywhere. It's just a whole different mentality. Not that it makes them any better than us in terms of being able to not to resist their sin and resist the isolation of modern culture, but America does seem especially isolated and especially prone to that. I can do it all myself and I don't need you, and it's not true.
And it seemed for so long that we had unlimited resources here too in America. And, it's not true either. But I think in many other parts of the world, that's already known that we don't, right? So
Right.
we have to learn that lesson before we destroy everything.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Valuing each other, valuing community, valuing the resources we have, and valuing that we're all co-creatures together on this earth. And it's not just about me, right? It's about all of us and all of the creatures that God has made as well.
Yeah. I think the what you were talking about with the duties of the king, God's view of what the king is supposed to be, is remarkably helpful.
Yeah.
We are not to lift ourselves up above everybody else or above creation. That we serve this world as God would serve this world. That is our role as the image.
And just one other thing about that, I think it's sad that actually there's no king that does all of those things in the Bible.
Right.
The only one is actually Saul, interestingly. So he writes out a copy of the Torah. He only has one wife, at least for the majority of his life. He doesn't have an army. He doesn't gather up money for himself. And yet his heart isn't with God, right?
Yeah.
So I think even there's one other element, right? We can do all the right things, but God is also calling us to give us his heart, give him our hearts, right? And that what is in the heart is ultimately where the rest of everything comes from. And to me, that's really significant too, as we're thinking about these things, right? Our heart needs to change, because if our heart doesn't change, it's hard. We're still motivated by money, greed, all of these things, right?
Yep.
And so our heart is where the foundation for everything else in our lives.
Yep, that's right. All right. Well, I think unfortunately we're out of town. Out of town. We're out of time. I'm still in town, but we are out of time. I don't know where my brain is, but we're out of time. All right. Anyway, thank you so much, Rahel. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think we're gonna get a lot of comments on this. That'll be fun.
I'm sorry I went maybe in directions I shouldn't have. But...
No. Good directions. I mean, I don't know how we get away from it. This is what is in the scripture. And if you want to turn it into, domination and tyranny and whatnot, that's not what God is calling us to do. It's clear that that's not what God is calling us to do. So if people want to comment, well, sorry. Not sorry. Paul, you got any final comments, questions you want to mention here?
No, I think that's been a fascinating conversation as before when we talked about animals. Lots of thought-provoking things to think about. I'm sorry I've had some problems in this episode with my with my microphone, so I kept fairly quiet in the background because my mic keeps cutting out. So anyway, I hope this is going to work out. So it's been a good conversation.
We'll edit it out. The audience will be none the wiser. They won't even know that you've been in and out. But all right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Do remember to like and subscribe, all that good stuff. Hit that notification bell. Share this with your friends. Share this with your enemies. Post all your outrageous comments and outraged comments, because that just drives up our engagement in the algorithm or whatever. Even as we sit here griping about social media, we're playing the game, right? So, help us out. Anyway, so we will. This is the end of our Creation Theology series. This is not, of course, the end of our engagement with creation theology. You know as well as we do that we do cover biblical and theological topics as much as we do science. So you can bet we'll be back again with more of that in the future. Maybe not just a series like this, but we will definitely be considering our place in God's creation. So we will catch you again in 2 weeks for a new episode. See you then.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.